Welcome to our new podcast, Rock and Roll and Biblical Wisdom. This is our first episode. Today on the episode, it's me, Jeremiah Childers,
Sarah Hanks,
Ken Berry,
and we are going to have a conversation around songs that lead us into thinking about some biblical wisdom. And today, our first song we will talk about comes from the Beatles, We Can Work It Out. But before that, I'd like to tell a couple of stories to kind of tell you why we're doing this podcast, Rock
Please
and Roll and Biblical Wisdom.
yes.
So I thought it's summer, it'd be fun to have some biblical, theological conversations around things that kind of we do in the summer. One thing I like to do in the summer is to go outside and to listen to music. And I grew up listening to rock and roll music, so that's my genre. If you're a country music person, listen to country music. If you like jazz, listen to jazz. Blues, listen to blues.
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, she's her own category.
She is.
She does not have a pigeonhole. One of my favorite memories growing up, and it's a funny memory, is one weekend during the summer, my brother and I, who were probably about 8 or 9 at the time, were taken to our grandparents' house to spend the night because my mom, my dad, and my older sister, who's 7 years older, got to go to an Aerosmith concert. And as they were going to Charlotte to Aerosmith, we stayed with my grandparents, and my grandparents did not like rock and roll music. They were very conservative, they grew up very fundamental, and rock and roll music was the devil.
It's the deal.
And oftentimes they would talk about Elvis and say, you know, Elvis used to sing gospel, but now look at what happened to him. Just the correlation, rock and roll equaled death.
Oh,
I know.
pretty.
So we got dropped off, and while they got to go listen to Aerosmith, who we listened to in the car with my mom and my dad, and we knew all the songs and thought it would be great to go to a concert, we got to listen to Gaither VHS tapes.
What a swap off.
And that memory is just a memory of two things don't have to be, you can like both things.
Yeah.
One thing's secular, one thing's sacred. And most of my life, a lot of my memories with music happens to be around my mom, my dad, friends, and listening to stuff that's on the radio, that's, you know, and I grew up listening to all the music my parents grew up listening to, and it's kind of cemented in my mind. So that's one memory of rock and roll and maybe Jesus, that kind of interrelated. And the second one was in seminary. I had two professors. Dr. West was our preaching professor, and in his class we had to make a notebook for the semester with essentially sermon illustrations, and we had to be on the lookout for where God was speaking. And Dr. West reminded us that God speaks in everything and everywhere. And it could be in a movie, it could be in a book, it could be on the news, it could be in a song. Mm-hmm. And over the years, there have been songs that were written for a different reason that speak to me. One of the great illustrations of that was another professor, Dr. Goodman, who passed away when I was in seminary, but he was a New Testament professor, and he loved rock and roll, and he would often quote songs in class. And the Who's We Won't Get Fooled Again, he would quote, anytime we talked about the Roman Empire, he would say the Roman Empire essentially was the same as the Seleucids, same as the Greeks, same as the Babylonians, same as the Assyrians, all the way back to Pharaoh. And he would quote the song, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." And, you know, that was a song that for him kind of stood out. And it gave me permission to say, you know, some of the things I grew up listening to weren't necessarily bad. And one of the great things about music is one generation's music that the children like, the parents hate. By the time you have grandchildren, it's what's playing on commercials that's playing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this our podcast over the summer, we're going to take some popular songs that most people hopefully have heard. I mentioned some to Sarah, and she's like, I don't know that song. So Sarah's going to mention some songs down the road, hopefully, that maybe if she's around to be on the podcast. Kelly will be here some. Ken, I hopefully can be here. We'll have some groups doing our podcast. But
I will say I mentioned a lot that you did not like.
yeah, but I might like them later, so
Oh, okay.
I'll go back and listen to
Cool,
them
cool.
more. Yeah.
Well, and that's the beauty of music. It touches so many
It
different
does.
people in different ways and different styles that you go, ugh. It doesn't resonate with you, but it does with someone else. It's
Right.
magical.
And one of the things I'll just mention on here, we're not promoting any of the band's former, present. We're not promoting their lifestyle. We're not even promoting necessarily their songs. What we're doing is saying the songs that we've heard, we have somehow connected. And we're going to look at that and then look at some biblical text to help us with that. And hopefully you'll have fun listening to this. And maybe you'll tune in to some of the songs and go listen to them on Spotify, YouTube, other places.
With a different vision of how it's going.
So our first song we're going to look at is We Can Work It Out. So when y'all hear the title of that song, is that a song that y'all are familiar with?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So it's a Beatles song recorded first in 1965, but the way I heard it growing up wasn't the Beatles, but Stevie Wonder. And I like the Stevie Wonder version a lot better. It's got a lot more pep to it, and I can just imagine, Stevie Wonder as he's singing, and just imagine all the different kind of conversations I've had with people where you're trying to figure out, we both can't be right.
Right.
So how do we work this thing out?
Yep.
So I'm just going to read a couple of the lyrics because I can't sing, and we don't have permission to play these songs on Spotify or YouTube. So we've got to be careful what we do. But the lyrics go, try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can't go on? While you see it your way, run the risk of following that our love may not last long. We can work it out. We can work it out. Think of what you're saying. You can get it wrong and still think you are all right. Think of what I'm saying. We can work it out and get it straight or say goodnight. We can work it out. We can work it out. We can work it out. Life is very short and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. I have always thought it's a crime. So I'll ask you once again, try to see it my way. Only time will tell if I am right or if I am wrong. While you see it your way, there's a chance that we may fall apart before too long. We can work it out. We can work it out. And you can go back and listen to that song. So when you think of that song, and you think of it in terms of how do we think about that song in terms of the life of church, in terms of relationships, what are some thoughts that you have when you hear that song? What are some of the ways that you've thought about that song?
To me, it reminds me that we get to lovingly interact with other people, and I do not have a monopoly on the truth. And luckily, the Beatles helped me understand that. Not everything I do is right. On rare occasions, that resonates with me. A lot of other times, no, I'm pretty sure I'm right, and I am not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think when I think of this song, it just is what we're supposed to do as Christians. We don't have to always agree. We can agree to disagree, but we do need to be kind to one another and respect each other's difference of opinions.
Yeah.
If love is the main thing motivating us, and that's the goal of all believers, then different opinions might get heated for a little while, and then when it's over, we still fall back into our love of Christ and what we share more than what our opinions are about things.
And we live in such a divided time where every issue seems to be polarizing, whether it is in politics, whether it is in sports, whether it is in church, economy. I want to read a Psalm 133, and Psalm 133 is a very short psalm. It's only 3 verses, and it's one of those about one of the things that's very rare in the world is when brothers get along. So it says, how good and very pleasant it is when kindreds live together in unity, when brothers live together in unity. It is like precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard, on the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord ordained his blessing, live forevermore, life forevermore. And the psalm is just, the blessedness of unity is so great that it's like the things that happen when you are in worship and when you're in the temple, because it's rare. So as we think about this, a couple of biblical stories came to mind, and let me kind of just talk about them. We'll see what y'all think. So the first story is Cain and Abel. So if you go back to the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis is essentially a book about brothers. The whole book is really essentially a book about brothers. After you get the creation story, you get the two first brothers, and there's Cain and Abel. And what happens in the story?
They decide to offer up to God. My offering is correct. This is the only way to do it.
Yeah.
And
in the story, Cain looks at how God favors Abel's offering and becomes jealous, becomes frustrated, and out of his frustration, God comes to him and says, listen, you're about to do something bad, and sin's lurking at the door, ready to devour you. You can master this, or it can master you. And he ends up killing his brother. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the story of brothers are the story of Isaac and Ishmael. Two brothers that have the same father, different mothers. Both are seeking to have something from their father. And one brother gets pushed away. And their relationship never comes back together.
And the ramifications of their split affect us even today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Isaac has Jacob and Esau. And Jacob and Esau's relationship is a relationship where Jacob steals Esau's blessing from his father. The second son essentially becomes the first son. And their relationship is one where Jacob has to flee for his life. Mm-hmm. And it's only later in life that they come back together, but they never really get together.
Right.
There's a sense of it's not going to be a Cain and Abel story.
No.
It's not going to be a Isaac and Ishmael where they're not together, but this one is...
It's just never going to be the same.
It's never going to be the same.
Wasn't physically killed, but the relationship took a big hit.
It did. Mm-hmm. But the last story is the story of Joseph and his brothers. And in that story, Joseph's a young kid, but he still does some dumb stuff. Just like brothers, sometimes you can have an ego, you can be arrogant, and the brothers get tired of it, and they're ready to let him go because he's favored by his father. And they're going to kill him. They ended up not killing him, sold him into slavery. And when he gets an opportunity to either take revenge, he stops that kind of cycle of violence. Right. And he says at the end of Genesis, do I stand in the place of God to you? Mm-hmm. And in many ways he does. He's able to offer them forgiveness and wholeness. And they still question it until Jacob dies, and they come to him and says, do you still hold a grudge to us? And he cries and weeps with them and says no. So the book of Genesis is a story about, can we work it out? Can we see each other's perspectives? Can we heal each other? And the hope that Genesis leaves, that there is possibility that we can work it out. Right? Mm-hmm. That there can be forgiveness in these generational disputes. The New Testament, one of my favorite stories out of the New Testament comes in the book of Acts, and it's in Acts 15. So we're not going to read all of that, but think about what it would have been like to be an early follower of Jesus, and you're Jewish, and now these Gentiles are coming in.
Newbies coming to the neighborhood.
Very stressful.
Yeah.
These outsiders are becoming insiders, and the question is, do they have to become like us?
Or do you have to become like them?
Or do we have to become like them? Are there going to be compromises? Mm-hmm. And the early church is struggling with this. And you've got Paul and Barnabas who have gone out and worked in Antioch and saw the Holy Spirit moving. You saw Peter going out to Cornelius' house and seeing the Spirit move before they're circumcised, before they're baptized, all of this. And they come back and they report all this to the Jerusalem leadership, and they're like, well, we've got to figure out how we're going to work this out.
Mm-hmm.
We've never done it that way before.
Yeah. So before we kind of go to the Genesis 15 text, what are some ways that we see church sometimes struggle with these kind of issues? How are we going to work it out?
Sometimes welcoming, if you're in a smaller community and it's been that way for generations, to have that community start to grow and new families come in. Mm-hmm. Well, they're not the royalty in the church, but now they're exercising their gifts, and we need to share. And I'm not so sure if I can welcome them in. I'm losing some of my status and importance. It's sad, but it happens.
Yeah.
Or sometimes problems just never get discussed. They just kind of get swept under the rug, and then things fester and fester and fester, and then blow up. And whereas the problem probably wouldn't have been so big if we would have just started talking about it and working it out from the beginning.
And in all those instances, when we lose sight of who we're following and the example that he gave us, if we're striving to be more like Jesus and be good at the things Jesus was good at, these other things are really pretty minor.
Yeah.
But we can take our eyes off the centerpiece, the mark.
And we would think today that somebody that comes to church and wasn't circumcised, maybe ate foods that like pork, we wouldn't have an issue with that.
Right.
One, we wouldn't ask the question.
We would not know the first one.
We would not know. And the second one, we wouldn't ask. So today we look at these kind of issues and say, well, those aren't big issues. But for the early church, those were huge issues. Because the question was, could you follow Jesus and not be Jewish?
Right.
Could you follow Jesus and not take on Torah, the covenant law? So I'm just going to read a few passages out of Acts 15, so to give us a little bit more clarity. Let outsiders inside is kind of the idea of what Paul and Barnabas have been doing. They've been going out to places like Antioch, and they've seen all of these different people, Jew and Gentile, free and slave, rich and poor, male and female, together in worship. And they see the Spirit working. They've been reporting back. But not everybody's happy about it. It wasn't long before some Jews showed up in Judea insisting everyone be circumcised. And these were Jewish Christians. If you're not circumcised in the Mosaic fashion, you can't be saved. So that becomes a question. Can you be saved? Can you be made whole by Jesus if you've not taken on these kind of things?
Right.
And sometimes we would say, if you don't believe exactly like us,
Right.
or if you don't think of our dogma or these tenets of faith that necessarily maybe aren't the central parts of faith, but kind of the periphery of things, then you can't be saved. Those might be things that we would think today. Paul and Barnabas were up on their feet at once in fierce protest. The church decided to resolve the matter by sending Paul, Barnabas, and a few others to put it before the apostles and leaders in Jerusalem. So delegation goes to Jerusalem. After they were sent off on their way, they told everyone they met as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria about the breakthrough to the non-Jewish outsiders. Everyone who heard the news cheered. It was terrific news.
Yeah.
I mean, today when people, unconventional groups, come to know Jesus, do we celebrate it or do we get
A little suspicious.
a little suspicious?
Is this real?
Yeah.
They don't look like me.
When they got to Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas were graciously received by the whole church, including the apostles and the leaders. They reported on their recent journey, how God had used them to open things up to outsiders. Now, some Pharisees, who were Jewish Christians, stood up to say their piece. They had become believers, but continued to hold to the hard party line of the Pharisees. You have to circumcise the pagan converts, he said. You must keep the law of Moses. You must make them keep it. The apostles and leaders called a special meeting to consider the matter. The arguments went on and on, back and forth, getting more and more heated. We've never been in heated conversations with people that we love about things, have we?
Oh, never.
Those are other people's problems.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't do that. Me and Ken don't do that.
No.
Yeah. I mean, there's never been like a Thanksgiving meal where politics get brought
It
up
got
and
testy.
get testy.
No, it's all just turkey and love
That
at my
would
house.
be dream Thanksgiving, wouldn't it?
The apostles and leaders called a special meeting to consider the matter. The arguments went on and on, back and forth. They got more heated. Peter took the floor. Friends, you know well that from early on God made it quite plain that he wanted the pagans, the Gentiles, to hear the message of God, of his good news, and embrace it. And not any second-hand or roundabout way, but first-hand, straight from my mouth. And God, who can't be fooled by any pretense on our part, has always known God's thoughts. gave the Holy Spirit exactly as he gave it to us. So Peter and Paul and Barnabas say the evidence that they already belong to God is the Holy Spirit's been working in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we to say that it's not?
Right.
By the end of the meeting, they come to compromises. So the compromises essentially are, okay, for the Gentiles, we're not going to require necessarily circumcision, but they've got to live really faithful lives.
Right.
Some of the things that they're doing or they've done in the past, they've got to stop doing. So you see the early church, Gentiles not going to events where maybe they would be tempted towards idolatry.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Staying away from maybe foods that were sacrificed to idols. And becoming more of in a world where sexual ethics were a lot different than in a Jewish tradition, becoming more conservative in their sexual ethic. Yeah. So for us today, when we hear like the conversation that went on, a heated debate in the early church, we don't think about that sometimes, especially in the book of Acts. A lot of people see the book of Acts, those first couple of chapters, they're giving all their property away, they're living in common, and everything's great.
They're reveling in being filled with the Holy Spirit for the first time.
And that's kind of like when we first come to church. We just have this wonderful experience.
A honeymoon period.
You're high on Jesus.
Yep.
And the reality is sometimes we forget that everybody in the church is still human.
Mm-hmm.
We're still flawed. We still sin. We still have our own thoughts and opinions and biases. And even in church, sometimes those things can cause conflict. And the early church models for us that you can work it out.
Mm-hmm.
That you can begin to look at each other's different sides and say, I may not always agree with your side. I might be right, you might be right, but usually somewhere in the middle is where we're at.
Yes.
Well, I watched this show called Pardon the Interruption, and it's two people that have done this show for 20-something years. One of them is like a 75-year-old Jewish man that was a sports writer, and the other one is a man of color in his early 60s. They both were sports writers, and now they're doing this TV show. And they have different opinions, and they argue like crazy, and you think, man, they must hate each other. And then when the show's over, it's just a love fest. They just have come to the point where they can debate heatedly, but that's minor compared to their affection and love for each other. That's their overwhelming desire is to remain friends regardless of that. And that's just a sports show. Those are things that aren't even important.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the people in Acts, it reminds me of the church today, because I think we want people to come to church looking a certain way. And we have these judgments like, you can't be a Christian if you have tattoos, or you can't worship Jesus if you have holes in your jeans, or,
Sandals? Are you kidding?
right, you can't do that. And so that's what I think Acts is all about, is they're like, this focus is all about just worshiping.
Right.
And it doesn't matter that you're different than what I'm like.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we bring all that judgment into the church with
We do.
us, and we just really need to leave it at the door, because we're all there for the same thing.
Well, and try to remind ourselves that we are supposed to be markedly different than the world.
Mm-hmm.
We should be able to stand out because, wow, they get along pretty good in that place. And there's a lot of different people, and they still seem to love each other and respect each other. Don't agree with each other on every point, but it's not a deal breaker.
One of the great things I love about the story in Acts 15 is you've essentially got three groups. You've got the Pharisaic Jewish Christians who are very super conservative. They're very fundamental in the way that they view the law and the way that you've got to be. And the reality is they don't change.
Well, they spend a whole lifetime getting to that point.
And nobody condemns them for being that way.
No.
And they say, you can continue to live that way.
Right.
And then you've got the extreme other group is Paul and Barnabas, who essentially say, you can't be too fundamental when you've got people that are coming in from the outside, because the reality is they don't need to necessarily be like you. They need to be like Jesus.
Right.
So, and then you've got the middle group, which is kind of the Jewish leadership. You've got Peter, you've got James and others who who are kind of stuck in the middle, and they're kind of the moderate group, and they see both sides, and they say, listen, the only way we can work this out is both have to compromise.
Right.
So at the end, it seemed the Holy Spirit in verse 28, 29 should not be saddled with crushing burdens, but be responsible only for these bare necessities. Be careful not to get involved in activities connected with idols, like we talked about. Avoid serving food offensive to Jewish Christians. So if you're at a table with somebody that gets offended with something, don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, respect them.
Respect other people and guard the morality of sex and marriage. And that's essentially saying, you know, if you are a household, if you are a leader of a household and you're Gentile, you can't have sexual relations with people under you other than your wife.
Right.
Which was a norm.
Right.
You know, for us, we don't think about
Right.
that. You know, that's
It's a given.
yeah, but for them, it was they're my property. I can do with them as I please. So there's things there. So as we think about this today, as we leave our conversation, I want everybody that kind of listens to this to think about in your life, where are you struggling to work it out with somebody? Could be your spouse. It could be a child. It could be a parent. It could be somebody in your Sunday school class.
Yep.
It could be somebody in the church. It could be another church or other Christians, you know,
A friend.
a friend.
And it's very encouraging to know that the Holy Spirit can help us in those changes. There's changes we don't even think it's possible for us to do, and by ourselves it isn't. But we can get nudges, and we can grow. We might not reach the perfection, but we can head in that direction.
Yeah. And to end with wise words from the Beatles, life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. I've always thought it's a crime. So I will ask you once again, try to see it my way. Only time will tell if I am right or wrong. While you see it your way, there's a chance that we might fall apart before too long. We can work it out.
We can work it out.
Work it out.
We will work it out.
Well, we'll see y'all next week, or hear you next week. Listen to us next week, however that works on the Spotify podcast.
It's confusing.
It is confusing. And we will talk about another song and another issue that applies to all of our lives.
Groovy.
All right, let's sing We Can Work It Out. Come on, kid.
Try to see it my way.
Yeah.
That's all I got with this voice today.
Okay, we'll see
Okay.
you. We'll hear you next week.
All righty.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.